Good morning, students. Today is Wednesday, 20 January 2021. We're going to get started with our lectures today. I hope everything is going well on your end. I hope you're able to get to Canvas and locate your course and locate the materials that have been posted. I have so far put up the syllabus on Canvas, the reading list. I have posted chapter 1 of our book by Fred Feldman. And by the way, sometime today, I will be posting chapter 2. You're going to be reading chapter 2 for next week, both lectures. So find some time between today and, let's say, Tuesday next week to read at least the first couple of sections of chapter 2. In fact, specifically, I'd like you to read the section entitled Actions and the section entitled Evaluations of Normative Status. And those are the first two sections of chapter 2. So make sure you stay ahead of me in the reading. And again, I'll post chapter 2 on Canvas later today. One thing I neglected to mention the other day, or yesterday I guess it was, when I did my first lecture, I will, 1 week before the first exam, I will post on Canvas what I call sample examination questions. Now there will be only a few, probably 5 true-false questions and 5 multiple choice questions. And the purpose of my posting them is to give you an idea of what my exam questions are like. And keep in mind that I may include some of those sample questions on the actual exam, so it's in your interest to study them carefully and at least remember the answers. And I will put the answers at the end of that document. Now I'm going to do that only one time. I'm going to do that only for the first exam for obvious reasons. The purpose of it is to show you what my exams are like. By the time you have taken the first exam, you will already know what my exams are like, and there will be no need for me to put up any sample questions for the second or third exam. Okay, so let's get started. I asked you to read 2 sections from chapter 1 for today. The first one is entitled The Philosophical Study of Morality, and the second one is entitled, if I can find it in my notes, The Value of Moral Philosophy. By the way, I have my lecture notes here in front of me, leaning up against my computer stand. So if you see my eyes going up and down, I'm simply glancing at my notes, as any professor would during the lecture. So let's get started on that first section entitled The Philosophical Study of Morality. Now, what's the title of this course that you're enrolled in? It's Ethics. So you're taking an ethics course. What is ethics? Well, the term ethics has been defined in different ways by different philosophers, as you might expect. One of the most common ways to define the term ethics is the philosophical study of morality. So there's this thing called morality, and different people study it. One of the people who studies it is a philosopher. So the philosophical study of morality you can think of as ethics. Another way to put it is moral philosophy. Moral philosophy is simply ethics. Now, what is morality? If ethics is the philosophical study of morality, well, you would think we would need to know what morality is. Now, Feldman has a long section, which I'm skipping, in which he goes over some possibilities to explain what morality is. I decided I would neglect or ignore that subsection, or that section, and cover only the 2 other sections that I've asked you to read. So let's just stipulate, for purposes of going forward, let's just stipulate that morality is, and I'm going to quote Feldman from time to time. I'll always tell you when I'm quoting him. On page 9 of his book, Feldman says that we are going to stipulate that morality is, quote, the set of all the true or correct moral principles, unquote. Now that, of course, leaves a lot to be desired, because the immediate question you would have is, well, what are those correct moral principles, those true moral principles? Well, that's what the course is about. The course will be an attempt to state the true or correct moral principles, and that will be what morality is. And so ethics is the philosophical study of that. It's the philosophical study of the true or correct set of moral principles. Now, what is a philosophical study of something? Because remember, the term ethics is defined as the philosophical study of morality. We've stipulated the meaning of the term morality. What is a philosophical study? That's what this section is all about. Feldman says on page 9, he asks the following question: what are the main forms of philosophical inquiry into morality? What are the main forms? And he says on page 13 that there are at least 5 varieties of philosophical study. And I'm going to go over them with you now in roughly the first half of today's lecture. Let me first of all list them, and I'll tell you when I'm coming to the next one. The first philosophical study, or the first variety of moral philosophy, is what's called descriptive morals. As soon as I finish running through the list, I'll come back to that one. Descriptive morals. The second one, Feldman calls non-theoretic morals. The word theoretic, of course, comes from the word theory. So non-theoretic morals is morals that don't have anything to do with theory. They don't presuppose any particular theory. Let's call that non-theoretic morals. And I'll say more about that in a moment. The third of the 5 philosophical activities is called normative ethics. Normative ethics. And that's going to be the focus of our course. We're going to spend the whole course looking at various normative ethical theories, such as utilitarianism. Okay, the fourth philosophical activity is called meta-ethics. M-E-T-A-E-T-H-I-C-S. Some people put a hyphen in between meta and ethics, but Feldman doesn't. Okay, meta-ethics. I'll say a few words about that in a moment. The fifth and final philosophical activity Feldman calls moralizing. Moralizing. So we have 5 distinct philosophical activities. Some of them are more distinctively philosophical than others, and I'll tell you which is which as we go along. So let's get started. Let's go back to descriptive morals and work our way through the 5 activities. On page 9, Feldman says that descriptive morals is, quote, the study of varying moral beliefs. You might also, in addition to the word beliefs, you might put mores. Have you ever heard that word, mores? The mores are the ways of life of a particular culture or society. It's the kind of thing that is studied by anthropologists. They go out to other cultures and study their mores. Notice the connection between mores and morality, or mores and morals. Other things that can be studied in a descriptive way are practices. Every culture, every society has its own moral practices, which can be studied by historians, sociologists, anthropologists, and others. Also, customs. Surely you've heard that word. Every society or culture has its own customs. Traditions, right? There are traditions that exist in each society. There are conventions. A convention is an agreement of some sort by which people live. Right? There's a convention, perhaps, that we drive on the right side of the road. And it's conventional that in the United States, people drive on the right. In other cultures, there's a different convention. In Great Britain, people drive on the left side of the road. So conventions, which can be thought of as agreements, are different in different cultures. We might even talk about whole ways of life. We might say the American way of life differs from the German or Chinese way of life. So the point I'm making is that descriptive morals has to do with the actual way of life or customs or traditions or practices of a particular society. And it is the sort of thing that social scientists such as historians and anthropologists study. But some philosophers have actually engaged in this activity. It's not particularly philosophical, but it has been studied by philosophers. Feldman gives a couple of examples. He says in a footnote that Richard Brandt, who was a philosopher, Richard Brandt, at one point in his career when he was a young man, went to live among the Hopi Indians in the American Southwest. And he studied them, he lived among them, talked to them, observed them, and eventually he wrote a book about their ethics. He called it Hopi Ethics, a Theoretical Analysis. That book was published in 1954. So here we have a philosopher, Richard Brandt, studying in a descriptive way the mores, the ethics, the beliefs, the practices of a particular culture. Another example is a book by John Ladd. John Ladd, L-A-D-D, was a philosopher. He died in 2011. And he, like Brandt, went and lived among a particular Indian tribe. In this case, the Navajo Indians, also of the American Southwest. And Ladd wrote a book entitled The Structure of a Moral Code, a philosophical analysis of ethical discourse applied to the ethics of the Navajo Indians. So descriptive morals is usually carried out by scientists, anthropologists, sociologists, historians, and so forth, linguists. But some philosophers have dabbled in this field as well, Brandt, Ladd, and others. So I guess we could say that, strictly speaking, this is not a philosophical activity, but philosophers are interested in it and sometimes participate in it. Brandt says on page 9 that when you study other cultures in a descriptive way, it, quote, you may develop a sort of enlightened tolerance for moral diversity. So if you stay within your own culture your whole life, you may not have an appreciation for the diversity of ways of life. But if you travel, if you go out among other peoples, if you travel to different cultures and societies, you may develop an appreciation for the sheer diversity of ways of doing things morally, different marital practices, different attitudes toward lying or keeping promises, different ways of child rearing. So you may get an appreciation for diversity. Now, let's be careful because diversity is not necessarily a good thing. And you can see this by asking, would we or should we tolerate practices that have existed in other cultures? Should we tolerate cannibalism? What if someone wanted to eat human flesh? Should we allow it? I suspect most of you would say, no, we should not. We should be intolerant toward cannibals. It's not a practice that we want or should adopt. In fact, we should condemn it. If cannibalism is practiced in other cultures, then to that extent, those cultures should be condemned for it. Other practices that we should perhaps be intolerant of are female genital cutting, or genital, some people call it genital mutilation, although I think that's a loaded term. What about polygamy? Some cultures practice polygamy. Should we adopt that practice? What about incest, which is sexual relations between people who are related to one another within a certain degree? What about human slavery? It's a very common human institution going back to the ancient world. And it is still practiced today in various cultures. So should we adopt slavery? Should we adopt a favorable attitude towards slavery? Is that part of what it means to be an open-minded person? What about human sacrifice? That has been practiced in various human cultures. What about torture? What about infanticide or putting infants to death? So my point is that diversity may seem to be an inherently good thing, a diversity of ways of doing things. But when you think about it, some things should be condemned. Some practices should be condemned and not endorsed or accepted or celebrated. I would add this: just as it's possible to be too close-minded, it's possible to be too open-minded. Sometimes you have to make judgments and say, no, that practice is wrong. And if it exists, it should be abolished as soon as possible. And if it doesn't exist, then by all means, we should not adopt it in our own culture. So that's enough about descriptive morals. It's a philosophical activity. It's been carried out by certain philosophers, but primarily it's left to the social scientists to work on. Let's move on to the second of the 5 activities. This one is called non-theoretic morals. Feldman defines it on page 10 as follows. He says, non-theoretic morals is the, quote, attempt without making any explicit appeal to fully general moral principles to develop and defend positions on important moral issues, unquote. So notice, the person doing non-theoretic morals is taking a stand, taking a position on some issue, and making an argument that that issue either should or should not be adopted or practiced. What makes it non-theoretic morals is that there's no theory being appealed to. The person making the argument doesn't explicitly appeal to utilitarianism or Kantianism or egoism or any other normative ethical theory. Now, what are these issues that are dealt with in non-theoretic morals? Feldman lists just a few on page 10. He lists the morality of war or warfare, euthanasia, which is, think of euthanasia as mercy killing, putting people to death at their own request. Competent people who are perhaps racked with terrible pain and maybe are going to die soon anyway, who ask you to end their lives. That's called euthanasia. And people take positions on the rightness or wrongness of euthanasia. Another issue Feldman mentions is sexism, sexist language, treating people differently on account of their sex. We might add racism to the list for the same reasons. And things like vegetarianism. Some people argue that, morally speaking, you ought to be a vegetarian. You ought to abstain from eating animal flesh because the animal flesh came from animals who were badly treated, who were deprived of their liberty, and who suffered during the production of the meat. So Feldman lists just a handful of issues that are dealt with under the heading of non-theoretic morals. Here are a few that I would add to the list. I'm not going to say much about them, if anything. I'm just going to list a few other issues. Abortion, infanticide, torture. Now, torture can be done for different purposes. Some torture is carried out for sadistic reasons. The only purpose of the torture is to impose pain and suffering on someone, and the torturer presumably derives some pleasure or satisfaction from that. We can call that sadistic torture. There's also what's called interrogational torture, where the purpose of the torture is to get information from someone who won't disclose it voluntarily. It could be information about where a bomb is located or where hostages are being kept. And the goal is to save lives or prevent other harms. Third, there is what's called punitive torture, which is torturing people as punishment for their crimes. And that's been common throughout human history as a form of punishment. We can call that punitive torture. Okay, other issues that might be dealt with under the heading of non-theoretic morals: preferential hiring or admissions to college. Think of that as affirmative action programs. Experimentation on non-human animals. As you probably know, laboratories, scientists use animals in their experiments. Some of those experiments cause pain and suffering and deprivation to the animals. Is that morally acceptable? Different people take different positions on that, and they argue either for or against experimentation on these non-human animals. What about genetic enhancement? Doing things with gene therapy to enhance people's cognitive abilities or physical abilities. Right? There's a whole ethics that's grown up around genetic enhancement. Issues like racism and sexism, which I mentioned a moment ago, rape and date rape. One of the philosophical questions about date rape is, what is it? How does date rape differ from rape, simple rape, or violent rape? Other issues that are dealt with under this heading are marriage, homosexual or same-sex marriage, issues like cryopreservation, where people have their bodies frozen upon death, or parts of their bodies, such as their heads, in the hope of one day having those bodies revived by scientists with new technology and new techniques. What about different forms of marriage, like polygamy or polyamory? And finally, a topic that's in the news a lot today, censorship. What are the ethics of censorship, or deplatforming, or doxing of people? Is it ever permissible for government to censor others? What about big tech? What about companies like Twitter or Facebook kicking people off their platforms? Is that censorship? And if so, is there anything wrong with it? And if there is something wrong with it, why is it wrong? So there are a lot of issues that fall under this heading, and philosophers have done as much as anyone else to participate in those debates. So you find philosophers writing articles with titles like "The Case for Animal Experimentation," or "The Case for Vegetarianism," or "The Case Against Warfare," or "The Case Against Torture." So philosophers take positions. They make a stand on a particular issue, and they make arguments. And they criticize the arguments of their opponents on those very same issues. Other names for this are applied ethics and practical ethics. Practical ethics, applied ethics. All right, let's move on to the third of the 5 philosophical studies, types of philosophical study. The third one is called normative ethics, and I don't want to say a lot about it because we're going to be spending the whole rest of the course on this topic. So I'll just give you a quick sketch. On page 10 of his book, Feldman says that normative ethics, or what we might call normative ethical theory, is, quote, the attempt to discover, formulate, and defend the most fundamental principles about morally right action, unquote. So the goal here is abstract. It's not to focus on one particular issue like abortion. The question is more general and more abstract. The question is, what is it that makes any act, abortion or any other act, right or wrong? What is it? Is it the fact that the act has certain consequences, good or bad consequences? Is that what makes an act right or wrong? Is it because the act is of a certain type, like lying? Some people hold the view that any act of lying is wrong because it's of the type lying. And in their view, lying, the type of act called lying, is always wrong. If that were true, then any particular act of lying would be wrong because it falls under the type, lying. So normative ethics is an attempt to answer a very abstract question. What exactly is it that makes an act right or wrong? And that'll be our focus in this course. Feldman gives an example. He calls it a rather garbled example of a normative ethical theory. He says on page 10, the theory goes like this: an act is morally right if and only if it produces the greatest happiness of the greatest number. That's a garbled version of act utilitarianism, as you will see starting next week when we get to that topic. We're going to also examine theories called rule utilitarianism, egoism, Kantianism, and Rossian pluralism. So we've got a number of distinct theories to discuss this semester. Now notice that when you defend a theory, you're strictly speaking, you're defending it from attacks by other people. So if you have a theory that you think is the correct theory of right and wrong, you need to do two things. First of all, you need to provide a positive argument in favor of the theory. And we can think of that as supporting the theory with reasons, by giving reasons for it. But you should also defend your theory from attacks by other people. Other people, as you will see, attack, let's say, utilitarianism. If I'm a utilitarian, I'm not only going to give reasons to think that my theory is true, but I'm going to have to fend off the attacks by other theorists who think that my theory is false or incorrect. So a theorist always has at least two jobs to do: support your theory and fend off attacks by others who are trying to show that your theory is false. Okay, now we're going to spend a lot of time on various normative ethical theories. In fact, if you look at the reading list, you'll see all of the theories. Chapters 2, 3, and 4 all have to do with act utilitarianism. So why so many chapters on that one theory? Because it's a very old and still widely held theory. And many people think it's the best place to start. Unless you find reasons to reject act utilitarianism, you have no reason to go on to find another theory. The second theory, which we discuss in Chapter 5, is called rule utilitarianism. The third theory that we'll be discussing in this course is called egoism. The fourth theory that we'll be discussing is called Kantianism, and we're going to have 2 whole chapters on it because, again, it's very important and very old. And finally, we'll end the course with a theory called Rossian pluralism. It's a theory developed by the Scottish philosopher William David Ross. Okay, back to our list. We're making progress. We've covered the first 3 types of philosophical study. Let's go on to the fourth one now. It's called meta-ethics. Now, the word meta means, that prefix meta, it means above and beyond. So what would meta-ethics be? Meta-ethics is the study that goes above and beyond ethics. It's about the most fundamental aspects of ethics. So here's how Feldman puts it on page 11. Meta-ethics, Feldman says, is the attempt, quote, attempt, among other things, to discover and explain the meanings of the crucial terms of moral appraisal, unquote. So one of the things people do in meta-ethics is they ask fundamental questions, very abstract questions, such as, what is the meaning of the word good? When I say so-and-so is a good person, or you are a good person because you did such and such, what does that mean when we say things like that? What does the word bad mean, as in so-and-so is a bad person, or it's bad that there is so much suffering? That's a moral use of the term. Someone might say, it's morally bad that somebody is suffering or that there's so much suffering in the world. What exactly does that mean to say that something is morally bad? Other terms that meta-ethics concerns itself with are right and wrong, ought and ought not, should and should not, fair and unfair, just and unjust. So there are a lot of terms that we use when we make moral judgments. Meta-ethics asks, what do those terms mean? What exactly is the meaning of those terms? Another meta-ethical activity is, on page 11, Feldman says, is studying the logical features of moral concepts. So we might ask, what's the logic of an ought statement? If I say you ought to call your mother more often, right? That's a moral judgment. What's the logic of that judgment? Are we saying that you must call your mother if we say you ought to? Are we saying that you ought to, all things considered, given all the facts of your situation, you ought to call her? Exactly what do we mean when we make a judgment like that? Now, Feldman gives a couple of examples that show what metaethics does. These are principles that have to do with moral obligation. Let's take them one at a time. I'm going to read them slowly. Number 1, and this is from page 11. If a person morally ought to do an act A, call it Act A, and it's impossible for him or her to do A without also doing Act B, then that person morally ought to do B. Okay? Is that a correct principle of moral obligation? It's been much discussed by philosophers. Once again, suppose I have a moral obligation to do Act A, and suppose I can't do A without also doing B. Does it follow that I have an obligation to do B? And answers to that differ. Some say yes, some say no. And it's not enough just to give an answer. You need to support your answer, whichever answer you give. Here's another one. And I'll read from Feldman on page 11. If a person morally ought to do an act A, and he or she morally ought to do another act B, then he or she morally ought to do both A and B. Okay? Suppose I have a moral obligation to do Act A, and I also have a moral obligation to do Act B. It seems to follow that I have a moral obligation to do both A and B. The problem is, it may not be possible for me to do both A and B. So something has to give. Right? Maybe we'll want to say that I didn't have an obligation to do Act A after all, or I didn't have an obligation to do Act B after all. So these are the kinds of things that meta-ethicists do. Okay? They're very abstract questions about the logic of our moral concepts, about the nature of our moral obligations, about the meaning of moral terms, and so on. Will we be doing any metaethics in this class? Very little. In fact, Feldman devotes chapters 11 through 15 of this book to doing metaethics. And we will not be discussing any of those chapters. So there's simply too much in this one book to cover in a single semester. So I've chosen to focus only on the chapters that have to do with normative ethics or normative ethical theory. And that would be chapters 2 through 10. We're going to cover chapters 2 through 10 in this course. Okay, one more activity. This is number 5. It's called moralizing. It's what Feldman calls moralizing. What does that mean? Well, look at page 11, and here's what Feldman says. He said, moralizing is the, quote, attempt, and we might add here, the attempt by authors of books and articles on ethics. It's the attempt to make their readers become morally better people, more virtuous people. And how might this be done? Well, Feldman mentions a couple of possibilities. One way to make your readers better people is to get them to, quote, pay more attention to the needs of others. Some people are simply inattentive or careless or indifferent to others. If you can get people to care about others, you will be making them morally better people. Now, how you do that, I don't know. But some people try to do it. And the people who try to do it are called moralizers. They're trying to make their readers or listeners better people. Another thing they might do is to get their readers or listeners, quote, to reflect more carefully on the possible consequences of their actions, unquote. How many people have you seen who make rash decisions? Sometimes very important decisions. These are people who make a decision, but they didn't put a lot of thought into it. And one of the things they neglected to think about is what will happen if they do it, as opposed to what will happen if they choose not to do it. or choose to do something else, right? People are sometimes short-sighted. We act on the spur of the moment. We do things rashly without putting any thought or enough thought into them, and we end up regretting it. We end up doing things that have unintended bad consequences for ourselves or for others. So if your goal is to make people morally better, you'll find a way, try to find a way to get them to think more about the consequences of their actions, both in the short run and in the long run. Because sometimes actions have good consequences in the short run, but bad consequences in the long run. So if you ignore the long run, you're going to be making a decision that may have good consequences right away, but eventually those good consequences will be swamped or outweighed by the long-term bad consequences. So if I had children, I would try to get them, I would want them to be morally good people, and I would want them to think hard about the consequences of their actions before they perform those actions, and I would want them to be considerate of others. Take others into account when you decide what to do. And not only human beings, but animals. Animals can suffer. Animals can feel pain. Some of what we humans do adversely affects animals. Dogs, cats, cows, horses, pigs, sheep, wild animals, foxes, and so on. So we should be considerate of other sentient beings. Sentient, let me spell it for you, Sentient. A sentient being is a being who's capable of suffering. And that includes most humans, but it also includes a great many animals, certainly all mammals, but also birds, reptiles. Surely they can feel pain as well. Okay, so that's called moralizing. And Feldman points out on page 11 that traditionally philosophers have tried to do this. That may surprise you. You may think that moralizing is something that should be left to preachers or ministers. And it is done by preachers and ministers, no doubt about it. But Feldman says that some philosophers have tried to do it as well. So you may find a philosopher who writes a book trying to persuade his or her readers to abstain from meat, to become a vegetarian. And the author thinks that that will make you a better person. You will be bringing less suffering into the world if you are a vegetarian. All right? What does Feldman say about moralizing? On page 13, Feldman says, and I like this, Feldman has a certain wittiness to him, and I may point it out to you from time to time. You may notice it on your own. But I've been reading Feldman, not just this book many times, but articles that he's written. Feldman has a certain wit to him, and he's fun to read for that reason. Feldman says on page 13, this book does not contain much moralizing. If you feel that you are in need of moral uplift, you will have to look elsewhere for it. Now, I think that's witty and funny. He's saying, if you need moral uplift, you go to your preacher or your minister or some trusted elder, but don't look to this book for moral uplift. Okay? You're not going to find it here, or you're not likely to find it here. Okay, by the way, earlier when we were discussing non-theoretic morals, I neglected to say that if you're interested in contemporary moral problems, you should take our course of that name. We have a course here at UTA. I can't remember the number right offhand. I think it's 1304, Phil 1304, but I may be wrong about that. It's been a long time since I taught that course, is what I'm saying. But that course is entitled Contemporary Moral Problems. And there's no guarantee that your favorite moral topic will be discussed in that course, but the usual instructor, the typical instructor who teaches that course, will cover quite a few different topics, ranging from abortion to euthanasia to warfare, vegetarianism, and so on. So you're welcome to take our philosophy course of that title. Okay, we're about half done for the day. I I still want to cover the next section that I asked you to read. This one is entitled The Value of Moral Philosophy. So we have kind of an idea now of what moral philosophy is, right? It's a set of activities, 5 in particular, that we just covered. What's the value of it? I mean, why should anybody study moral philosophy? Why should anybody study ethics? What good can come of it for you or for anyone else? Feldman does think that studying ethics will be of use to people. It does have a value, in other words. So let's go back to the beginning. On page 13, Feldman just asked the question straight up. Why should we study moral philosophy? Why? Give me a reason. Right? I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical that it will have any value. So persuade me of its value. Now, Feldman says there are 2 extreme views on this, 2 extreme answers, and his view is in the middle. Feldman says that he has an intermediate position between the 2 extremes. So what are the 2 extremes? The first extreme is that studying, and I'm quoting Feldman from page 13, studying moral philosophy is essential to being, quote, a fully moral person, unquote. Now that's an extreme view, wouldn't you say? Is it your view that to be a fully moral and upright person, you have to study moral philosophy? That seems implausible. That's an extreme view. Someone might hold that view, but it seems implausible, at least to Feldman. And I agree with him. Here's the other, so that's at one end of the spectrum. Here's the other extreme. On page 13, Feldman says that some people say that studying moral philosophy, quote, does not in any way help one to become a morally better person, unquote. So we've got 2 extreme views. One of them says that you can't possibly be a morally decent person unless you study moral philosophy. The other one says, don't waste your time with it. No good will come from studying moral philosophy. It can't possibly help you become a morally better person. So those are extreme views. Feldman adopts an intermediate position. He rejects this extreme view and he rejects this extreme view. Feldman thinks that the study of moral philosophy can be useful. It can help people become a better person, but it can't guarantee it. It depends on exactly how you approach it and how you pursue it. So I'm going to list some of the ways that the study of moral philosophy can be of value to the person who studies it. And I have 4 possible ways. So let's go through them one at a time. The first way that the study of moral philosophy can be valuable is listed on page 15, or discussed on page 15. Feldman says, the study of moral philosophy can help us, quote, avoid holding inconsistent moral principles, unquote. Now, we don't want to believe inconsistent things. You wouldn't want to believe 2 different things when those 2 things cannot logically both be true. Right? So a rational person wants his or her beliefs to be, at a minimum, consistent. And that means that it's possible for all of them to be true. And philosophy can help you weed out beliefs that are inconsistent with one another. Right? A person trained in philosophy will be able to identify more easily inconsistent beliefs or principles so that you can get rid of one of them. If you discover that 2 of your beliefs can't possibly both be true, then you will try to figure out which one to give up, which one to cast out of your mind, so to speak. So let me quote from Feldman on pages 13 and 14. It's a little bit long, so listen carefully. Feldman says, when we study moral principles, we come to understand that some are incompatible with others, and we develop the ability to determine when this is the case. Hence, one great value of moral philosophy is that it may be able to help us sort out our principles and thereby enable us to avoid maintaining inconsistent sets of principles. So that would be, if that were to occur, that would be a good thing. That would be valuable. To the extent that philosophy helps us avoid having inconsistent beliefs or principles, to that extent, philosophy is a good thing. Okay, that's Feldman's view, and I wholeheartedly concur in that. Okay? Now, keep in mind that consistency, while it's a good thing, it's not sufficient. It's a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. And the reason for that is obvious. There could be an evil person who has consistent beliefs. I mean, someone like Hitler, just to pick an example where most people would agree that he's evil. Hitler may well have a consistent set of beliefs, but while that's a good thing that he have consistent beliefs, it matters what the beliefs are. Right? We don't want a consistent set of evil beliefs. We want a consistent set of good or virtuous beliefs. So consistency is necessary, but not sufficient. It's something we want, but it's not everything we want. So we would try to show Hitler that contrary to what he thinks, his beliefs are inconsistent, or we would try to find some other way to argue him out of his false beliefs so that his beliefs are no longer evil. I'm not saying that would succeed, but that's what a good person would try to do. And I'm not suggesting that the only way to deal with the Hitlers of the world is through rational persuasion. It may be that Hitler is immune to that. It may be that Hitler simply has to be stopped because his actions threaten great harm to others. Right? We simply have to stop him and perhaps even kill him. He may not be reasonable. We may not be able to reason with him and persuade him to stop doing what he's doing or to refrain from doing what he's proposing to do. Okay, the second of the four activities that are valuable, philosophical activities that are valuable, is the following, also on page 15. The study of moral philosophy may help us, quote, understand the principles we hold. So the idea this time is not that we're trying to avoid having inconsistent beliefs, but sometimes we don't put a great deal of thought into the principles that we actually hold. And when you think about your principles philosophically, you may discover that they have implications that you are not willing to accept. And it may also be true that you think that certain implications follow from your principles when in fact they don't. So let me give you a couple of examples of this. Well, actually, let me hold off on that until we get to the third value of moral philosophy. So Feldman says on page 14, the study of moral philosophy may help us to understand better the moral theory we already, in a rough form, hold. So moral philosophy helps you become more thoughtful. Right? It helps you understand the basis for your moral principles and not just the moral principles themselves. Right? It helps you engage in what's sometimes called values clarification. Right? That used to be the mantra for educators. They want their children to clarify, to help their children, their pupils, clarify their values. Right? It wasn't an attempt to change their values. It was an attempt to help them understand and get clear on what their values or principles really are. All right. Now, there are many examples where people, through the study of philosophy, helped understand something about themselves. Let me give myself as an example. Now, back when I was in law school, back in the late 70s and early 80s, I had a jumble of views, which may be true of you as well. I had a jumble of views about government and politics and how society should be organized, which laws were acceptable and unacceptable. Right? Like anyone else, I had a whole bunch of beliefs about a whole bunch of different subjects. One day when I was coming into the law school through the lobby, it was a cold winter day, I remember that, I noticed a stack of green brochures sitting by the heater. And maybe it's because it was cold and I went over to the heater to warm my hands or something. But I noticed a stack of green brochures, and I picked one up to look at it, and it was a publication of the Libertarian Party, right? Not the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, but the Libertarian Party. And I may have heard of that party, but I didn't know much about it. So I took the brochure, and later I read it. And I was amazed because what I read in that brochure described many of my own beliefs or principles. So I read more and more. I had a voracious appetite. I couldn't read enough about this theory. It seemed like I was learning about my own principles. I was exploring my own beliefs. And I eventually came to the point where I called myself a libertarian. I even joined the Libertarian Party. And I have a card to this day, a membership card from the Libertarian Party. And in 1980, I voted for the Libertarian candidate for president, a man named Ed Clark. Now, I wasn't a Libertarian for long, just a few years, and I eventually saw some problems with it. You might say I grew up, I changed my mind, or I had a conversion, and I became something else. So my point in telling you this story is that reading this brochure and giving it some thought, philosophical thought, helped me understand the principles that I already held, but in a rough form. Right? It helped me sharpen and understand my own principles. And sometimes when you study philosophy, you'll find that happens. It could happen in this course. I'm not trying to make it happen, but here's how it could happen. I'm sure you have a number of views right now about right and wrong. There are certain actions that you would immediately judge as right, and certain actions you would immediately judge as wrong. If I were to ask you what it is that makes all of the right acts right and the wrong acts wrong, you might be stumped. You might have no answer. Maybe during this course, you will find the answer. Maybe when we get to the chapter on egoism, once you've studied egoism, you may have the same experience I did with respect to libertarianism. You may say, wow, this theory, egoism, explains and systematizes my beliefs and my principles. And you may come to call yourself an egoist. And you may tell your friends, I'm an egoist about ethics. I'm an ethical egoist. And then they'll probably be puzzled, and you can explain what that is to them. So it's possible that during this course, you come to understand that you are already a utilitarian of some sort, or an egoist, or a Kantian, or a Rossian pluralist. Right? That could happen. You may have a kind of conversion experience, if you will, during this course. Okay, the third, we have 4 values of moral philosophy, 4 valuable aspects. That was 2. Here's the third one. On page 15, Feldman says that the study of moral philosophy may help us, quote, be clear about the consequences of our moral principles, unquote. So notice how this differs from number 2. The second value is that it helps us understand our own principles. The third one says we come to understand or get clear about the consequences of our principles, about what our principles imply or entail. Now, I have a couple of examples of this. In 1972, a young philosopher named Peter Singer, who's Australian, he's been teaching in the United States now for a couple of decades, but he's Australian. Peter Singer wrote an article entitled Famine, Affluence, and Morality. And in that article, he set out a principle that he thinks his readers already accept, even if they don't think about it. He said, look, you probably accept this. And the principle says this: if it's within your power to prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing anything morally comparable, then you should do it. let me say it again. If it's within your power to perform an act that will prevent something bad from happening, and it will come at no cost to you, morally speaking, then you ought to do it. It's a principle that Singer thinks all or almost all of his readers accept. What Singer proceeded to do in this essay is apply that principle to the case of famine and derive the conclusion that you, his reader, have an obligation morally to give resources to the people in various parts of the world who are suffering and dying for lack of food and medical care. So what Singer was doing was trying to show his readers that their own principles have implications or consequences that they may be unaware of. He's trying to motivate people to live up to their own principles, their own moral principles. It was a shocking essay. Many people who read it immediately felt guilty because of the way they were living their lives. These are people who had a certain amount of affluence, people who replaced their winter coat every year, not because the old coat, there was something wrong with the old coat, but simply because they wanted another color or style. And Singer said, why do you need another coat? Take the money that you would spend on that new coat and send it to Oxfam, for example, which is a famine relief organization. You could do some real good with the money that you would otherwise spend on frivolous things. And he mentions lots of other frivolous things besides buying new clothing when your old clothing is perfectly serviceable. So that's one example. It's my example, not Feldman's, but I'm trying to illustrate his point that if you study philosophy, you may discover that there are consequences of your principles you were unaware of. And you either must change your behavior to live up to your own principles, or you must abandon your principles and replace them with other principles. Singer was trying to force his readers to make that choice. Either live up to your principle or deny that you endorse this principle, which he thought most people would not be able or willing to do. Another example, in 1971, it just so happens in the same journal, Philosophy and Public Affairs, a philosopher named Judith Jarvis Thomson wrote an article entitled A Defense of Abortion. And you can track it down if you want. Go into the UTA library and go into the databases and type in Philosophy and Public Affairs as the name of the journal. Go to 1971 and you can find her essay and you can read it. The same is true for Singer's essay. Judith Jarvis Thomson, in her defense of abortion, addressed herself to a particular argument that she had heard many times. Some people argued that since fetuses have a right to life, and since aborting them kills them, it's wrong to abort. And what Thomson tried to show in this article is that that doesn't follow. Even if you concede that a fetus has a right to life from the very moment of conception, it doesn't follow that aborting it or killing it is wrong, morally wrong. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of her argument. My point is this. What Thomson tried to show is that this particular principle about the right to life does not have the consequence that many people think it has. It does not have the consequence that it's wrong for a woman to have an abortion. So Singer tried to show that a particular principle had a certain unwelcome consequence. Thomson tries to show that a particular principle does not have a certain consequence. And both of them are philosophers. Both of them are trying to persuade their readers, philosophical or non-philosophical readers, that a certain consequence either does or does not follow from a certain belief or principle. Feldman says on page 14, surely if one holds a moral theory at all, it is better to hold that theory with some understanding of what it implies and what it does not imply in particular cases. And I think you'll agree with that, right? If you're going to hold a principle, a moral principle, surely you need to know what it implies and what it doesn't imply. Right? That would seem to be a bare minimum that's required for holding a principle. Really, we might say, do you really hold a principle if you don't even understand what its consequences are or are not? And finally, the fourth value of moral philosophy, or the study of moral philosophy, is it helps us, quote, be skeptical about faddish moral doctrines. Now, Feldman is a little bit obscure in this one. Feldman makes it seem as though there are people out there in society who are trying to hoodwink us or dupe us. They're trying to sell us something. And you can probably fill in examples. There are people who are out there trying to convert others to particular religions. Sometimes they knock on your door and hand you literature to try to convert you. Politicians want your money, they want your time, and ultimately they want your vote. And they will give a spiel to various people to try to persuade them to donate, to vote, to volunteer, to serve on the campaign. There are people in the marketplace, the commercial marketplace, who want to sell us products, right? They want to sell us the new vacuum cleaner, and they will tell you all of its virtues, maybe ignore the vices, the cost, things like that. So Feldman's point seems to be, if you've studied moral philosophy, you're able to defend yourself more easily from people who would hoodwink you or bowl you over in various ways. I think what Feldman is saying is that if you study moral philosophy, you acquire a set of skills that help you defend yourself from others, from other people who are trying to persuade you with bad arguments. Now, there's nothing wrong with being persuaded. Don't walk away with that message. But you shouldn't allow yourself to be persuaded by bad reasons. You should allow yourself to be persuaded by good reasons only. So that's the point Feldman is making. If you study moral philosophy, you will be in a better position to sift the good reasons from the bad ones. It's kind of verbal self-defense, right? You're defending yourself from the words that are being used to try to persuade you of something, to buy something, to do something, to believe something. And this ties in very nicely with the traditional role of philosophy. Traditionally, philosophy is about giving reasons for what you believe and what you do, and demanding that other people give reasons as well. Right? Philosophy is involved in reason giving. We should give reasons. We should be prepared to give reasons for our beliefs and our own actions, and we should always ask other people for their reasons, for their beliefs and their actions. If I discover that somebody believes in aliens or a certain type of alien, I have every right to say, what are your reasons for that? Give me your evidence. Why do you believe that? Right? Now, maybe the evidence will be good and I'll become a convert. Maybe the evidence is so overwhelming that I will start believing in aliens. But it's also possible that I will find fault with the other person's evidence or reasons or grounds. So philosophy is about reason giving, a back and forth, demanding or requesting reasons for other people's beliefs. Okay, I'm almost done for the day. Let me move over to my next sheet. Feldman says, to conclude this on page 14, once we have studied moral philosophy for a while, we may begin to see the enormous difficulty of the subject, and we may recognize how absurd most popular moral slogans really are. We may begin to sense the complexity and subtlety of our moral concepts, unquote. All of that is from page 14. So Feldman thinks that philosophy does have a useful purpose to serve in helping us not only sort out our beliefs and principles, but it helps us appreciate the difficulty of moral philosophy, of ethics. It is an incredibly difficult and complicated subject, as you will see during this course. Right? It's not just a matter of coming up with a slogan to express your views, like do whatever feels good. That's absurd, isn't it? Do whatever feels good. Live and let live. Those are absurd positions to take, and they could easily be refuted. What if it makes me feel good to commit genocide? Then someone who says do it if it feels good is telling me commit genocide because it makes me feel good. Right? Clearly that's unacceptable. That's a faddish moral doctrine. Do whatever feels good, or live and let live. Okay? So those are dangerous doctrines, and philosophy can help us point out what's wrong with them and why they should be discarded. So what's Feldman's verdict? I told you earlier that Feldman takes an intermediate position between the two extremes. Remember that? Feldman believes that philosophy has only a negative value. Here's what he says, page 15. It may show us, that is the study of moral philosophy, it may show us that some principles are false. It may never be able to show us which principle is true or which principles are true. But philosophy can, Feldman thinks, can show us which principles are false. And if that's true, that would be progress, wouldn't it? So suppose that initially there are 10 theories on the table. Let my fingers be the 10 theories, okay? Here are 10 theories standing. What if when we study moral philosophy, we're able to knock this one out and this one, okay? Well, we haven't narrowed it down to the one correct theory, admittedly, but now we're down to 8. We had 10. Now we've reduced the number of theories still standing to 8. And maybe down the road, we'll be able to knock out another theory, reducing it to 7. So the idea is philosophy can help you dispose of certain clearly false doctrines or principles or beliefs. And that's progress, right? We now have only 7 theories to debate and discuss, whereas when we started, we had 10. Feldman is not optimistic that we'll ever be able to reduce the number to just 1. Here's what he says about that. On page 15, now I'm going to intersperse some of my own words with his words. So I'm just going to read it as though it's one long quotation. Page 15. After weeding out the false principles, we may be left with 2 or more fully general moral principles, each of which is self-consistent and independently quite plausible, but which are incompatible with each other. So we might be able to narrow it down to, let's say, 2 theories. These theories each are consistent, self-consistent, each one is consistent, each one has some plausibility to it, and yet they can't both be true. We may end up in a situation like that, right? That's entirely possible. We shouldn't expect too much from moral philosophy. We shouldn't expect that we're going to get a single, true, correct principle of right and wrong. We may be left with 2 or more candidates. And if that's the case, Feldman says, moral philosophy may have nothing further to offer. Moral philosophy has done all it can do. It narrowed 10 theories down to 2, and at that point, its usefulness stops. People are either going to pick this one for non-philosophical reasons, or they're going to pick this one, right? But philosophy can't tell people which one is true or correct. That could be where we end up. And finally, also on page 15, Feldman goes back to his original question. Can philosophy make us better people? can the study of moral philosophy make us better people? And in effect, here's his answer. And it's an if. He's not going to assert this. He's going to say, if it's better for us to avoid inconsistency, and if it's better for us to understand our own principles, and if it's better for us to be clear about the consequences of our own principles, and if it's good for us to be skeptical about the consequences of faddish moral doctrines, then yes, the careful study of moral philosophy can help us to be better persons, unquote. So Feldman's view is he's described 4 values of moral philosophy, and then he comes back and says, if doing moral philosophy, if doing each of these things makes us a morally better people, then yes, moral philosophy can make us morally better because it helps us do those 4 things. Okay? So Feldman, I know that may seem non-committal to you, like Feldman is being wishy-washy, but he's trying to be careful. Right? He doesn't want to come out boldly and claim that moral philosophy will always make us better people. So he's just saying if it's good to be consistent and if it's good to understand your own principles, then studying moral philosophy will make us better people, morally speaking. Okay, it took an hour and 11 minutes to do this lecture. I promise they won't all go more than an hour, but this one happened to go that long. Maybe I should have spent one day on each of these 2 sections, but I'd rather devote more time to the theories themselves. So I compressed 2 sections into one lecture, but I think I gave you the gist of it. I hope you agree with that. And you can see that there's plenty of material for me to test you on. In fact, I'll be going in the next day or so to draft exam questions based upon what I just lectured on and what you just read in Feldman. So I'm going to ask you specific questions on the exam about the various types of philosophical activity, such as non-theoretic morals and moralizing. And I'm going to ask you particular questions about the value of moral philosophy that have to do with the 4 things we just now discussed. So I hope you made good notes as you read the chapter, and I hope you make good notes while you listen to my lecture. So I'm going to see you next week. You've had your 2 lectures for this week, and I'll probably see you on Tuesday for the first lecture next week. Make sure you have read the first 2 sections of Chapter 2, and I'm going to be posting Chapter 2 sometime today. So find some time this weekend to read those first 2 sections carefully. All right, have a great day and a great weekend. I'll see you next week.